To be sure, the White House actually talks about the move against Huawei, essentially placing Huawei on its entity list as a separate track from the trade negotiations. But I can guarantee you that is not how Beijing is viewing this latest move. And already Eurasia Group has downgraded our call for a U.S.-China trade deal by the G20 in June. This is when Trump and Xi are next scheduled to meet. Just this past week, we downgraded our call of what was to be a 60% probability that both sides would reach a trade deal to just 15%. That downgrade happened before this latest U.S. move against Huawei. So we can expect a further escalation, a further hardening on the part of Beijing that will make progress on onward trade negotiations even much more challenging to come by.
Would this kind of approach work differently if the country on the other side was not China, where culturally this idea of saving face, of having pride when you approach negotiations, were not so important?
Certainly, saving face in the Chinese context is part and parcel of what Xi Jinping is having to deal with here. But more broadly, it's more so about how Beijing views this move against Huawei. They don't see it as the U.S. side does, as a means of answering to previous behavior by that company that contravened U.S. sanctions. They see it as a purely political move that is designed to contain China, to keep China down, including in high-tech sectors of which Huawei is its most important technology company. So they see this as politically linked to the trade negotiations and as further evidence that the U.S. is not negotiating in good faith, but is negotiating to keep the U.S. on top of the strategic sectors of the future.
You know, the phrase that stood out to me from the Chinese last week was when they said what they wanted was a balanced deal. I guess they felt like the president was beating them up too much, and there wasn't much retaliation in return. So I'm wondering how much more retaliation can we expect, and what would that look like from the Chinese, do you think?
The Chinese certainly have to be very careful in how they choose to retaliate. And Beijing's initial response aside, we would assume that it's going to take several days in careful consideration before we see the way that Beijing will decide to respond. Now, why is that? It's essentially that, in Beijing's view, in order for it to succeed in its long-term struggle against the United States, it has to retain economic resiliency. So Xi Jinping, so long as his economy can withstand the additional pressure from the U.S. with tariffs or other escalations, he will not need to capitulate to U.S. demands. And that is why Beijing may choose to retaliate. We certainly do see increased risk for U.S. companies operating in China, but it will be careful not to overly respond in a way that will scare off U.S. company investment and further FDI from companies from other foreign countries as well. It will have to take more of a balanced view and a balanced move in its effort to retaliate.